From the time of Queen Esther, a name you can find in the Old Testament book that bears her name, Jews around the world have celebrated the annual Feast of Purim. Now, Purim gets its name from the word pur, and pur means lot or a throwing of the dice. And I'll explain that a bit more as I tell you my story. Every year, Jews get together and they celebrate the Feast of Purim. And not just read the story during that festival, but everybody there joins in. So when the villain's name is mentioned, they all boo. I'm not saying do that today, but I'm just letting you know what they do. And when the heroine or hero is mentioned, they all cheer. And so because of that participation, the book of Esther is one of the most widely known stories in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, understand also that what some men intended for evil, God worked about in his sovereignty to bring good out of that. Now, I am a fourth-generation Jew living in exile. During the time of King Nebuchadnezzar, he sent his army down to attack the nation of Israel. He did that because our people had turned their backs on God. No matter how many prophets God sent to them, warning them, return to the Lord, they refused to do so. Living in their pagan practices, doing things that were despicable in the eyes of God. Until finally God said, enough is enough. You like this pagan way of life, you can go live in a pagan place. So the king came down, they won that battle, and many of our people who survived led off into captivity back to Babylon, and over time scattered throughout the Babylonian Empire. Now, oh, this is great. Anyway, so they were scattered, and our people were led down to the city of Susa, is where our people settled, and some of my relatives died, and so one young cousin who still survived, we took her and raised her as our own daughter. And she grew into a very beautiful young woman. Her name is Esther, which is her Persian name, just as Mordecai is my Persian name. Now, the king, it was the third year of the king Xerxes' reign. And King Xerxes ruled a kingdom that stretched from what you know as modern-day India all the way west and then south into North Africa, as far down as what is modern-day Ethiopia. A vast empire, 127 provinces the king ruled over. In the third year, he decides, I want to have a banquet and have all my officials come and celebrate and see my splendor, my wealth, my importance. And so anybody who was anybody in his kingdom came to the city of Susa. Princes and military leaders, anybody who was important came with their wives for this huge banquet. Now, it wasn't just an ordinary banquet, because this banquet lasted 180 days. That's 6 months. This banquet went on. You talk about an endless buffet. Now, the men were with the king in one part of the palace grounds, and the women were with the queen Vashti in the other part of the palace grounds. Now, when that 180 days were over and people began to go home, the king decided, I'm not done yet. I want to party some more. So he held a banquet for 7 more days for all those living within the walled city of the city of Susa itself. From the least in his kingdom to the most important, came to the king's palace to celebrate some more. Now, the custom of the day was when the king took his goblet, then you could drink. If he didn't raise his goblet, you did not drink. That just wasn't done. But on these last 7 days, the king thought we're in a good mood. So he told his wine servants, you let the men drink as much as they want, of whatever is serving, as often as they want. Well, by the end of the 7th day, the king was feeling quite merry. I'm surprised he didn't even stand, but that's beside the point. But he decides, I want to bring my queen in here because she is beautiful. Queen Vashti was a beautiful woman. And he wanted to show off her beauty to the men who were here. And so he sent 7 servants, go to where the queen is, tell her the king summons you to come, make sure you put your crown on your head so the king can display your beauty. And for whatever reason, the queen said, no. No. Now, maybe she was just tired of the pomp and circumstance. Maybe she was tired of this endless party that wasn't stopping. Or maybe the thought of being paraded in front of a group of drunken men just turned her stomach. But she said, no, I refuse to go. The servants went back to the king, and the king noticed that the queen wasn't with them. And one brave servant says, Your Majesty, the queen is not coming. In fact, she refuses to come. And of course, word quickly spread throughout the men there that the queen had angry. No, he was furious. Nobody defies the king. Nobody defies the king. Not the ruler of 127 provinces, not me. So he called his advisors, his counselors, his wise men, those that knew the laws of the Medes and Persians, and he asked them, what should be done to the queen for refusing and defying the king? Well, they conferred together, talked about the laws and things to do, and they came back and says, Your Majesty, what Queen Vashti has done is not right. In fact, she has set a precedent. Word will get around throughout your kingdom that the queen has defied the king. She has despised the king, and therefore they will say, well, if the queen can defy the king, then we can defy our husbands as well. Anarchy will rule without your kingdom. That's not a good thing. If it please the king, have a scribe be called, write a new law, which will go into the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed, and banish the queen. She will never see your face again. Well, the king liked that idea. That will show her who's king around here. And so a scribe was called, the law was written, and the queen was banished, never to see the king again. Well, the banquet ended. People went home. But anarchy was not allowed. Peace would come to his kingdom. And life returned to normal. Well, almost, because as time went on, the king really missed Queen Vashti. He really loved her. But he had banished her and he couldn't bring her back. The law was the law. And as time passed, he was sad. He was really sad. And his servants saw that and they realized this is not a good thing. Sadness for a long period of time with the king is a sign of weakness, and someone might rise up and take over and kill him. Anarchy will ensue. And so they went to the king and said, Your Majesty, remember your wise men said that you can have a search made for a new queen, somebody better than Vashti. So scribes were called. Letters were written. Men were sent out from the palace there throughout his empire in search of beautiful young women who were brought to the palace. The new king or queen would be found. And this is where it affected our family, because I said Esther was a beautiful young woman. Well, she was noticed. And she was taken. And there was nothing we could do about that. Now, before she left, I said to her, took her aside, I said, do not tell anyone of your nationality. Don't tell anyone that you are a Jew. And she promised, I will keep that a secret. And off she went. Now, all these women were kept in one part of the king's harem, and the head man over the harem liked Esther. And he brought her, had her have a special diet, food, and called 7 servants for her, maids for her to help take care of her. And I found out where they were being kept. And I found that if I stayed near the king's gate, it was the closest place to where the harem was, I became friends with some of the servants so I could pass notes and messages to Esther, see how she's doing, and let us know what's going on. And so we can know and keep track, and because, we loved her. Well, as I did that, go back to, it had been 3 years since Vashti was deposed, and now it'd be 1 more year until a new queen could be chosen. In this intervening year, all these young women were taught beauty treatments. 6 months, understanding oil of myrrh to make their skin soft and smooth. And in 6 months, learning about cosmetics and perfumes. And then at the end of this 1 year period, one at a time, each young lady would go into the bedchamber of the king. Next day, go to another part of the palace where the concubines were. And when he was finished, he would decide who would be the new queen. And of all the women he saw, he chose Esther. Esther won his heart. He made her queen, a crown was put on her head, and guess what? They had another banquet. He loved banquets. And so they announced her as queen, and she got to rule with him. Mostly in figures only. Well, as I was at the king's gate much of the time, it was funny until the guards there didn't even notice me because I was just a fixture there. But I overheard 2 of those guards talking. They didn't like the king. In fact, they were plotting to assassinate the king. Now, if they killed the king, chances are they'd also kill the queen. Again, we'd have a little war take place. There is other people trying to vie for the role of king. And so I passed a note to one of the servants, take this to Queen Esther, make sure she reads it, and make sure she tells the king. And so they took the note to Esther. Esther read it. She told the king, 2 of your guards are trying to assassinate you or plotting to. He had it checked out, found it true, and they were executed. And what I had done was written into the chronicles of the events of the happenings of the king. And time passed. Now, there was a man within the kingdom, there in Susa, a nobleman who over time rose higher and higher in prominence as a nobleman. And a couple things to understand about Haman, that's his name. One is he's a very self-centered individual. I mean, as he rose to power, he was usually over the back of somebody else, always making it appear as though what he was doing was for the betterment of the king and the country, but really it was for the betterment of himself. And secondly, his descendant, he was a descendant of the Amalekites. The Amalekites, if you know your Old Testament history, was a nation that attacked the Israelites as they were leaving Egypt, going to the Promised Land. They didn't have to, but they chose to do that. Now, God intervened, helped them win that battle, but ever since, the Amalekites and Hebrews were at odds with each other, and that hatred was passed down from generation to generation. Now, the king liked Haman. And finally, the king made him his highest nobleman in the land. And he wrote an edict saying that as Haman is walking through the city, everybody else is to stop and bow in his presence to show him respect and honor. Well, I understood about protocol, and I also valued the king, but I was not going to bow to Haman. Haman didn't want me to bow out of respect. He wanted it out of worship of him and his mighty power and greatness. So whenever Haman came by through the king's court, if I was standing, I just remained standing. If I was sitting, I just remained seated. I didn't make a big deal of it. I just simply sat there or stood there. In fact, Haman never even knew, because he was so proud of himself. His head was always held high because we were simply there at the gate, nobodies. We were of no value to him. He was the one who was important. But those around me noticed. And they began to ask me, why won't you bow when Haman comes by? Day in and day out, why won't you bow? Finally, I said, I am a Jew. Haman's ancestors tried to kill our people. I will not bow to him. Well, it wasn't long before somebody told Haman. There's a man at the king's gate. His name is Mordecai. He is a Jew, and he refused to bow in your presence when you come by. Well, that made him angry. But Haman was also a schemer. If he was going to do something to elevate himself, he was going to do it in a big way. So next time he came by, he watched for me, found me, come corner of his eye, and just watched and noticed I neither rose nor looked fearful at all in his presence, which really made him angry. But he controlled himself, had his business with the king, and went home. And when he got home, he called his wife Zeresh, and he called his family and friends, and again talked about how important he is in the kingdom and how what a great person he is, how wealthy he is. But he said, there is a man at the gate whose name is Mordecai. He's a Jew who will not bow in my presence. And I will kill not only him, but all of his people. So he called for the dice. And they rolled the dice to see what day of the month they would attack the Jews. The next roll of dice was to decide which month of the year they would do this. Having the day and the month, he went to the king. Now, when you dehumanize people, when you see people as less than, it's much easier then to mistreat them or even kill them. And Haman went to the busy king and said, Your Majesty, there are people who are scattered throughout your empire that are of no value to you whatsoever. They have different customs than we do. They worship a different God and don't even acknowledge our gods that we worship. It would be in the best interest of the king if we could eradicate ourselves of this pestilence and have peace within your kingdom. In fact, I will even put money into the treasury for the cost it will be to have letters written and send messengers out to post these edicts throughout your land. The king said, that's a good idea. But you keep your money. And he called for his scribes. They wrote these edicts out, sent messengers out throughout his empire, and they posted these edicts in every town and village throughout his empire that on such and such a date, the good citizens of his realm were to rise up and kill every man, woman, and child of Jewish birth, and take their possessions and rid themselves of his blight. And Haman and the king sat down to drink wine and enjoy the peace that was coming to their kingdom. Well, when I read that edict when it was posted there in Susa, peace is not what I thought of. In fact, I tore my clothes. I bent down and got dust, and I flung it in the air unto myself and all over, and I began to wail loudly. Well, a servant went to Esther and said, Esther, Mordecai has torn his clothes, and he's wailing, throwing dust in the air. And so Esther had new clothes brought to me because you couldn't be at the king's gate if you were in clothes that show you were in mourning against protocol. Well, the clothes came, and I said, no, I can't accept these. You take them back. In fact, you tell the queen she must go see the king and plead for our lives. And I had given a copy of what the edict said. Word came back from Esther. She said, I have not seen the king's face for 30 days. And the law is nobody can just go into the inner court of the king unannounced, because if he does not then raise his scepter to acknowledge you, the penalty is death, even for a queen. I sent word back. Do not think that just because you are in the king's house, that you of all of our family will be spared. Deliverance will come from someplace, but you and your father's household will be destroyed. But who knows that God has brought you to this particular place for such a time as this? Esther reported back, what I want you to do is to fast for 3 days and 3 nights. Do not eat, do not drink. The morning of the fourth day, I will go and see the king, and if I die, I will die. So we in Susa, the Jews, we all fasted for 3 days and 3 nights. I guarantee you, we also prayed to the God of heaven. God, spare our people. Spare our people. The morning, that fourth morning, Esther got up, put on her most beautiful royal robe that she had, and put the crown on her head, and she began to walk toward the inner courts of the king, wondering, will this be the last day of my life? What will happen? Her heart was beating so loud she was sure other people could hear it. But she got to the doorway, and there was the king seated on his throne, and he held the scepter in his right hand, and she thought, what will he do? But he turned and saw her, and a smile came across his face. Esther, come in. Come in. Esther approached and touched the tip of his spear, knelt down. He said, Esther, what is your petition? I will give it to you. What is your request? Up to half my kingdom, it will be yours. What would you like? Oh, okay. Hold it together, she was saying. Hold it together. If I find favor in your sight, O king, would you and the nobleman Haman please come to a banquet I'm preparing at noon today? He liked that idea. Yes. He sent a messenger, go find Haman. Tell him on this hour to come to the queen's residence for a dinner, a banquet. Haman the king showed up, had a wonderful meal, but at the end of the meal, the king was reclining and with his cup of wine in hand, and he said, Esther, what is your petition? What do you want? I'll give it to you. What's your request? Up to half the kingdom, it is yours. She said, Your Majesty, if you will just come back tomorrow, you and Haman, during the banquet I'll prepare, I will tell you at that time. Okay, he said. And off they went. Now, as Haman went through the king's gate to go home, he saw me seated there and saw that I neither rose nor looked fearful at all in his presence, and he just seethed in anger. But he was too proud of himself. He wanted to get home and tell his wife and friends all the good things that happened that day, and so off he went. And he called his wife, Zeresh, he called his family and friends, and said, oh, you can't believe today. I was at a banquet with just the king and queen, just the 3 of us. And tomorrow, I've been summoned to another banquet with just 3 of us. I am so important to them. What a great thing. But, he said, it makes me angry that Mordecai the Jew who's at the king's gate shows me no respect, never bows, and doesn't fear me. Well, Zeresh, his wife, trying to console him, said, well, why don't you have a gallows built, make it 75 feet high, and then tomorrow morning, go to the king and ask the king to hang Mordecai on it, and then go to your dinner, the banquet, in peace. He liked that idea. Had some of his servants start building a gallows, which they did, and that night, Haman slept like a baby. I slept like a baby. Most people in Susa slept like a baby that night, but the king did not. The king tossed and turned, and I can tell you, if the king doesn't sleep, others in the palace will not sleep as well. And the king got up and he called for the royal scribe, and he said, I want you to read to me from some of the chronicles of events that happened in my kingdom. And he sat there on his throne as the scribe read and read and read and read and read, and the king wasn't going to sleep. And he keeps reading, and finally he gets a place where there was this plot to assassinate the king. And when Mordecai the Jew, who was at the king's gate, discovered that plot, told Esther the queen, and she told the king, the plot was uncovered, the men were were killed, and his life was spared. The king sits up on his throne hearing this, and he says, okay, listen, what reward did we give Mordecai? I mean, we want to give the one who saves his life some reward. If there's no reward, then the next time he hears a plot, he might not tell the king anything, because what value is that to him? But the scribe read it and said, well, nothing, your majesty. no reward was given to Mordecai. Well, but now it's daylight. And he hears some noise in the outer courtyard, and he asks, who is out there? And they say, Haman is out there. Oh, great. Bring Haman in. And Haman walks in, and the king says, Haman, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? And Haman's thinking, well, who besides me would the king want to honor? And so he's thinking, what can I do that will elevate me even more in the eyes of the people? He said, Your Majesty, if it please the king, have one of your robes, your royal robes, one that the people recognize that's the king's robe, and one of your noble horses, one with the king's crest there on its head, and have one of your high noblemen put the robe on the one you want to honor and have him help him up on the horse, and that nobleman can lead him around the streets of the city shouting out, this is what happens to the man the king delights to honor. And Haman saw himself on that horse. To the cheering of the people as they rode down the streets, up one and down the other. This is going to be great. And the king says, Haman, that's a great idea. I want you and a servant to get the robe and the horse. And I want you to put that robe onto Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. And you lead him through the streets of the city crying out, this is what happens to the man the king delights to honor. And I think you could have driven a chariot through Haman's open mouth as he's thinking, what just happened? What just happened? But the king said, Haman, go. Don't leave anything out. That's a great idea. So with a servant, we got the robe and we got the horse, and we went to where Mordecai, where I was, and he helped me up, and he put the robe on me and helped me on the horse, and through the city streets we went, with him shouting, this is what happens to the man the king delights to honor. You know, I almost felt sorry for Haman. Well, almost, not quite really. We got back to King's Gate, and he didn't even help me off. He told the servant to take care of the robe and me, and off he went to his home, just downcast. He was, oh, what has happened? And he got home, he called his wife and his friends and his family and said, you can't believe it. I went to see the king to have Mordecai executed. Instead, I was commanded by the king to elevate Mordecai, lead him throughout the city streets. How do I fix this? His wife Zeresh gave a prophecy. She said, because you went after Mordecai, who was a Jew, one of God's chosen people, this isn't the end. But I think it's the beginning of your own destruction. At that time, a servant of the king came. It was time for that second banquet, and off they went to that banquet. Mordecai's mind was a bit preoccupied over the meal, thinking, how can he rectify what had happened? How can he salvage this? The king and queen are talking, and it was a delicious meal. And finally, they get to the end, and the king says to Esther, what is your petition? And Mordecai wanted to know, yes, what does the queen want? What is your request? She said, if I have found favor in your sight, my petition is this, will you spare my life? And my request is, will you spare the lives of my people, because we have been sold to destruction. Well, Haman and the king are alert. They did not understand yet what was going on, what this really meant. The king said, who wants to take your life, Esther? Who wants to destroy your people? She said, this vile Haman. And the king understood the edict he had signed. He stood up and marched out of the banquet area. Haman realizes, I have one chance to save my life. And he goes to get closer to the queen, but his feet catch and he falls on top of her as she's reclining near the table. Just as the king comes back in and he yells out, will you also molest my queen in my presence? And 2 servants came and covered Haman's face and helped him up. Covering his face indicated he was going to be executed. Another servant said, Your Majesty, Haman had a gallows built by his house. It's 75 feet high. He wanted to hang Mordecai on it, the man who saved your life. And the king said, Hang him on it instead. Now, there is more to the story because as Esther pleaded, Your Majesty, please rescind the edict. He said, I cannot. It is in the law. It cannot be repealed. But I can write a new edict that your people can defend themselves if attacked. So back they went to the court. The scribes were called. Edicts were written in every language throughout the empire. Writers went out to deliver those edicts that on such and such a day, if Jews were attacked, they could defend themselves and take the plunder of those who had attacked them. Well, they defended themselves, but they did not take any plunder because it wasn't about the possessions. It was simply about survival of their lives. Now, Esther told the king who I was, that I was well related to them. I was brought into the palace. I was given some nice clothes to wear, even the signet ring that Haman had a prominent place there in the palace following that. You know, there are 3 important things I think we need to realize as I finish. The first is that, anger is an emotion God has given to us. We all can be angry. The scriptures say, be angry and sin not. Jesus was angry, but he did not sin. But what do you do when you get angry? Do you lash out and woe to anybody who is near? Or do you stop? Do you pause? Do you pray? God, what do you want me to do? What can I do that is good and right and honorable and not just lash out in anger? The second thing is that we all face things in life that seem insurmountable. And we can fear as though God is simply silent. God isn't working. God doesn't hear. The truth is God does hear. God does care. And God does work at times we don't even see what he's doing. But God is moving things into place at just the right time. God will act. And we'll see it. Have faith in the Lord. Not only that, but be people who pray. And sometimes even fast and pray. Fasting, going without food for a time, I think is the way in which you say to God, God, I'm really serious about this. I'm giving this up because I'm going to focus that time I would have eaten to praying to you, the God of heaven, the God of the universe. And the third thing is that what Mordecai told Esther is just as true for you today as it was for Esther back then. Who knows but that God has put you where you are for such a time as this. Your life matters. You're not an accident. Your life matters. And God wants to use you where he's placed you, where he's planted you, whether that's in your home, at school, at work, in the community. People know who you are, and they look at your life. They notice how you respond in situations, good and bad. Well, I know they go to church, but wow, their faith really means something to them. Because in that situation, boy, I would have reacted another way altogether, but they really do trust in this God they talk about. Understand that God has placed you where you are for a reason. And understand you can make a kingdom difference in the lives of people around you by what you say and what you do and how you treat them. Be people of God that make a difference and see people as people of value and worth. Honor them. Befriend them. Care about them. Trust the Lord. Let's pray. We thank you, Father, for this time together. We thank you, God, for your holy word. Help us to realize these stories in Scriptures didn't happen just a long time ago and are of no value. But God, they have deep meaning for us. Because these were real people who encountered these situations. Lord God, help us to be people of faith and courage and hope. And to share that with those around us.